Welcome back to our class. We are going to show you where we've been and where we're going today. And we have back here, last time we were talking about the presuppositions in Old Testament study. And everything on the left column of what we were talking about there about anthropomorphic worldview and so forth, we'll call them the bad guys. And the other side on the right side there were the good guys. And we're going to pick up where that leaves off and demonstrate what we were talking about there. So now we're going to deal with what's called the problem of the Old Testament. And you say, what's the problem? Because you don't have a problem. But scholars do worldwide and have for a long time. And their problem is one that is based on their unbelief. And yet we believe that biblical archaeology, notice the emphasis on the biblical, will be the answer to all this mountain of problem that has been going on for some time. So biblical archaeology is going to confront such unbelief, can I say, from the ground up, archaeologically. Well, to talk about this, I need to give you a brief on the history of Pentateuchal criticism. Because the action here all has to do with the first 5 books of Moses, and the rest of the Bible rest of the story moves through the rest of the Bible. There is no true historiography, the writing of history, without decisions that affect the selection and the type of presentation of the material. Each of us is concerned with the burning issues of our day, and yet each is a unique and creative participant within the general drift of scholarly interest. These things go on and on for many years. The subjective element, we talked about that last time, and the stamp of one's teachers and training are bound to enter into the writing of any history of interpretation. I talk about this as what happens when you go to a seminary and the whole thing that you get from that centers on the coffee cup. And you say, how can that be? But it's not so much always the instruction you receive from the lectern or the curriculum, but the coffee cup is what is shared during the breaks and after class and this sort of thing, when you and the professor perhaps can be face-to-face, or a group of you can be face-to-face. And that coffee cup will kind of fool you and make you think, well, I like this guy. I don't know what he's all about or what he's saying, but gee, he's friendly, and therefore he automatically sort of brings you into his world of thinking. And many a scholar and many a young Christian has fallen by the wayside just because of going to basically the wrong school when it comes to the Bible. But having a subjective bias, as I say, well, I have a subjective bias. It's called biblical bias, and I don't mind saying so. I freely acknowledge it. I freely acknowledge such. This may make us alert to the subjectivism of others. My slant to the Bible is going to go counter to the slants they have away from the Bible. Of investigative process in the humanities, as in the sciences for that matter, is often haphazard. You're going to be involved in investigation, in research. It's often haphazard, that's for sure. Occasioned by shifts in the reigning paradigm. Do you know that science goes from trend to trend, or even we could say, we call it trend to trend, or some model by which scholars proceed. The paradigm, of course, is the pattern of what the thinking is all about at that time. It is hoped that OT scholarship is moving toward the truth. I can almost say, put the truth up in quotation marks, but this is not automatically so. As in any scholarly endeavor, there are true, false, and blind paths of research. a true path, a false path, a blind path. Some of that is good in the sense that you're doing a term paper and you find that you've selected a subject or got your professor to agree to your subject. And so you go into that with the idea of finding the truth, but you come across various problems. You're going to find that maybe you have more research than you can use, more sources than you can use, and you get overwhelmed. Or you don't find that the problem is really a problem that you're trying to solve in your research. And then you find that you're in a blind, you're in some kind of stop spot. And I've had students who've been so frustrated over just selecting a topic. It seems to be something that has often been a problem. Only time will tell which path is the nearest to reality, and often we need decades of hindsight, and I've experienced that myself. I've done Daniel probably 15 times, or taught it 15 times, and I can say that hindsight has helped me with the interpretation, and my interpretation has gotten better, whereas my original Aramaic language work was where I started. That didn't give me all the interpretation. I had to come up with that elsewhere. Well, archaeological discoveries such as the Dead Sea Scrolls have influenced biblical studies. And while some kind of an empire that we would see, a new empire that would come up, we had that empire that was found around 1972 or so called Ebla. At the time, it was a real earth-shaking discovery. The excavator was Paolo Matille, and they found a whole empire that we didn't know existed before. And so a lot of people had to change their minds about this and that, and a lot of ideas that was early put out. Pettinato was his helper, and Pettinato had many ideas about how all this was going to be, and most of his views turned out to be wrong. So you got to proceed slowly. Anyway, today we have numerous interdisciplinary influences that are now shaping our perception of the Old Testament. It used to be you'd go and you'd dig and you'd come home and relate it to the Bible, but now there's all kinds of other things that are going on. All the sciences have kind of piled in on biblical studies. And again, some of that is good, and some of that is overwhelming, and some of that is turns out to be worthless. But we have things like structural linguistics, social anthropology, and literary interpretation, and really much, much more. Additionally, scholarship is often steered by an almost larger-than-life personality and personalities and schools of thought. Put the quotes around schools. This writer is indebted to W.F. Albright. I want you to do a search on William F. Albright. He was at Harvard, and he is the father of biblical archaeology, basically. And for a long, long time was America's leading Orientalist. And my own teacher was Giorgio Bucciolati, as I've mentioned before. And so I put him in here because he was one who was a groundbreaker in his field, which was Assyriology. He's one of the top 10 Assyriologists in the world. And then I would have to put in Stanislav Zegert, and he was a leading Northwest Semitic scholar. So we're talking about Hebrew, Aramaic, Phoenician, Moabite, and all this sort of thing. And this man here, really, his work is closest to the Bible, considering that he followed long after Albright. And why do I mention this? Well, I mention this because I want you to know where my bias comes from, and that is something that you should know, and I freely confess. Sometimes nationalism ties scholars together. A lot of the Old Testament studies took a beating during the time leading up to World War II because of the German thing. And with scholars from Germany not wanting to even look at anything Jewish at the time or criticizing it a lot, that was a tough time for Hebrew studies. In the Hebrew Bible of those days, they had many critical emendations. They wanted a lot of trouble with the text, and they were always pointing that out. And then after those war years, the more recent copy of the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or the Hebrew Bible that we all use, BHS, all those critical things begin to fade away, so that you can see that nationalism and the world at large has an effect on the way scholarship is conducted. The higher critical method that we'll be talking about was pioneered in Germany, and of course they're very scientific minded. You know, the Germans are kind of that way. My own ancestry points back to those days. Maybe I got a little bit of German analysis about me. This would come along about 10 years later and be passed on to England, and so the English scholars followed the German scholars. And in general, the same kind of thing would happen another 10 years later as the Americans followed the British, while the British followed the Germans. This is actually something very true that I've seen that's gone on. So we want to talk now about phases in the history of Pentateuchal criticism, and I'll go real lightly on part of this, but I want you to know there's always been some kind of activity, scribal activity, having to do with the Pentateuch.